But since this conclave is about pulses, you could consider coming to Malawi, leasing out land, empowering our farmers, and growing as much as of the pulses as you can. So I really want to thank the organizers of this conclave for organizing such a wonderful forum for people like us from Africa to share what we have with our colleagues from wherever you've come from. Once again, thank you so much. Thank you.
That whatever you produce, as far as pulses is concerned, India is ready to take that. So there is no constraint as far as improving pulses production in your country is concerned. And we are very happy that your farmers are benefiting by the endeavors of Mr. Patel and his company. Now I'll request Mr. Mohammed Wala, National Director of Agriculture, Government of Mozambique, to say a few words.
Good morning. First of all, I want to thank you, the Governor of India, representative of Mr. Rajiv, First Secretary of Minister of Consumer Affairs in India. Second, I want to thank you, Mr. Pravin, President India Pulses and Grains Association, to invite us, the Governor of Mozambique, and the Global Party Conclave, because Mozambique, I want to say, we have a commitment, compromise, and the challenge with the conclave, with the Governor of India, to best the quality, improve the quantity of the pulse in the Mozambique. And thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wala. Now I'll request today's one of the most important sort of speech by Mr. Brian Clancy. I'll request him to kindly say a few words.
I have a funny feeling I'm going to say more than just a few comments because I have a bit more than 2 or 3 minutes to speak, so I will try to make it as interesting as I can. I want to thank Pravin Dongre and the association for inviting me and for showing so much confidence in the work that I've been doing over the years and in the thoughts that I can bring to you today. I appreciate that greatly. One of the things is I was born in Manitoba, which thinks of itself as being in Western Canada. People in Western Canada, where I now live, think it's part of Eastern Canada. But it is an agricultural province. And it didn't matter what I did. I tried to get involved in writing novels. I tried to get involved in cinema and all kinds of things like that. But every step along the way as I grew up, I was drawn back to agriculture. Whether it was at university, I was studying arts. I ended up talking to a class in agricultural economics. I finished university and was looking for work in journalism. The first thing I did was write a history of the cooperative movement in agriculture in Western Canada. That project was over. I looked for another job in journalism. I became a reporter for a newspaper called Report on Farming, which is an agricultural newspaper. I spent my whole life in agriculture as a writer and as an export grain trader, and now for the last several years as a market analyst. And the one thing that to me is very exciting is to come to a country like India where agriculture is taken as seriously as it should be by all people in the world. And I really appreciate that opportunity to be here where agriculture is front page news instead of a little tiny paragraph buried somewhere in the back part of the newspaper. Pravin Dongre asked me to look more than past next year into the future, to look at the outlook for pulses and things like that. The problem is that I start working on something a little bit into the future and I keep asking myself, well, what next? What next? So I went much farther into the future than I was asked. One of the things that I looked at the population growth statistics for the world, it's growing currently at about 1% per year. In about 25, 30 years, it'll slow to around 0.5% per year of population growth. The average net, I looked at that, and then I took a look at the average caloric needs by sex and by age group, and projected that against the population growth, and it became apparent that agricultural output, food output, needs to rise by slightly more than 1% in order to keep pace with the growth of population through to the year 2050. One of the things that brought to mind, and you'll see this when I look at the slides, is that things like ethanol, the ethanol mandates in the United States, I think diverting any field crop into ethanol other than perhaps sugar is unsustainable. That is because the pressure for food needs from the world is going to become so large in the future that it's going to be very difficult to justify moving crops into fuel, burning crops as fuel, rather than burning them as human energy. This chart looks at the population growth into the future. That's the middle line going into the future. These are population forecasts from the US Census Bureau. The trend line is the growth that we've seen in agricultural output up until now, and as you can see, that stays slightly above the rate of population growth. But when you look at it more closely, you'll realize that the gap is shrinking. The big gap there that we see it in the early part at around 2006 to 2008 was the rapid expansion in corn production in the United States to meet ethanol needs. You can see as we go forward, though, that the food needs are going to shrink that gap significantly. The other line there is the one that's the scariest. Plant breeders in some parts of the world are reporting that they're gaining about 0.5% a year in yield gains, average yield gains from conventional plant breeding programs. If the world were to average only 0.5%, then you can see that the growth in the food supply would fall below the relative needs of the population. That is a problem. This demonstrates it more cogently. 0.5% annual increase. Eventually, you're going to reach a point where there are going to be absolute food shortages in the world. There are going to be extremely high prices. We're basically going to tilt back into the era of 1960 and prior, which was the time when the Green Revolution was initially started to answer world hunger. And if we get that low rate of growth in annual food output, we're going to end up back in exactly the same situation as we were several years ago. If we can maintain the current trend, which is close to 1%, we're still not getting, agricultural output is still not really keeping pace with the growth in population, and you can see that in the future, you are going to have years where there's going to be absolute shortages, because this is a trend line. I can't predict when a drought will happen, but we know they will. And we know there's going to be years where the food output is going to drop well below the needs of the human population. And those are going to be big problems. So what that suggests is that as we go forward through time, we may see periods of shortage and periods of extremely high prices, no matter what growth rate we have, unless we can grow faster. That's why it's very encouraging to hear the people from Africa talk about what's going on there. I've had people say to me that they felt that in the future Africa would be the breadbasket of the world. That would be nice, and I think it would be good for Africa, because to me, no region of the world, no country can grow its economy and grow its country for its people and have education for its children unless it has food self-sufficiency and food security. Because if people don't have to worry about where food's going to come from, they can then focus on raising their children and educating them and thinking about the future. And I really hope that I believe this is where Africa is going. It's just going to take time. Some people would like to see it happen in 2 years or 3 years. I don't think it's going to happen that quick. But to me, that's like trying to have things happen in TV time, which is a North American affliction. If it doesn't happen in TV time, we think it can't happen. And we just have to be more patient, and we will get there. Pulses are actually a very minor crop from a world's perspective. From our perspective in this industry and in this room, it's a really significant crop. I mean, after all, we spend all our lives dealing with it and thinking about it all the time. And believe it or not, I almost do think about it all the time. I tend to be a little bit too intense about the things that I work on, and as a result, I'm a really terrible conversationalist. So when we have people over, I sit silently in the room because I wonder why don't people want to talk about peas and lentils? All they want to talk about is hockey. I mean, who cares about hockey? Let's talk about lentils. Canada's pulse breeders, as I mentioned, think they can add 1% to the average yield per year. I don't know how long that can continue because plant breeders in other parts of the world say that they feel like they're reaching a roadblock, that suddenly they can't get those gains. So obviously, in order to meet the future potential, it's going to have to be a combination of things, whether it's from plant breeding, bringing new land into production, diverting food from non-food uses into food uses, improving storage in various countries of the world. India is a good example. Russia probably needs to do a lot to improve their storage as well, to reduce the crop losses during harvest and after harvest, to become smarter about the way we use the food ingredients so we maximize their potential in the diet so we can get the most use out of them, and resulting in less waste and things like that. And those are the sorts of things that I think need to happen to ensure that there are no future shortages. Pulses don't get the same attention as soybeans or wheat from plant breeders. As Gordon Bacon points out, wheat has been getting a lot of attention in terms of quality. Pulses do not. The focus on pulses has been on yield, but not on quality, and we're not as keen in that sector about figuring out all the different uses for the crop and how to make sure that the crop that's being grown more closely matches the needs of the market, which does improve the value of the crop both to the consumer and to the producer. The other point, obviously, is long-term yields may be less than 1%, which I've dwelt on a bit. The trend growth in field crops in millions of metric tons, if you're a trader, this is nice. I mean, it looks like there's not going to be a problem. There's going to be hundreds of millions of tons more grain to trade in the future than there is today. The growth profile for export nations and for traders is ever upward, although that hides the problem that the world faces, but for us who are interested in business, it always looks good because there is going to be continuous growth. Global pulse production has been shrinking as a share of the diet, and I'll show you that in another slide here. I came up with 3 scenarios for growth. This is based on mathematics, and they didn't quite work out the way I wanted to. I wanted to have a high, medium, low. You end up with a high, medium, low, but for different reasons. But you can see that in all cases, except one, there will be growth in the production of pulses in the world. How strong that growth is depends on whether or not we can bring new areas into production, such as expanding in Central Europe, the expansion in Africa, and places like that will be critical to expanding pulse production in the future. Canada could grow a lot more pulses than it does. It could, in theory, grow a third of its acreage in pulses and have that be workable. In practice, that probably isn't going to happen, but that's always theoretically possible. Canada also has 4 to 4.5 million acres of land, which can be easily be brought into production. It's currently being consciously summer fallowed every year, and that's something that could be a source of land in the future and would change the outlook for pulse production. If you look at it in the terms of all the varieties, edible beans is the largest share of the market. That's always been the case. Peas are fairly significant. Lentils, from a Canadian perspective, it's lentils and peas. Chickpeas being a very small commodity. From the world perspective, it's edible beans. This is the most troubling thing, is that when you look at the different outlooks for pulse production, is it looks like we could be very well going back into a period of reduced per capita consumption of pulses in the world. And that is just a reflection of a lack of proper expansion of supply. In returns from pulses are not being competitive enough to the farmer, which is not keeping them interested in the crop. And these are problems as we go forward. And under the different scenarios, the problem becomes more exaggerated in terms of what's going to be available to the human population. This just looks at it in a different way graphically, and I should have removed this one slide, but I didn't. And it just pictures it in a different way, and it's the exact same information, only it shows it by commodity. That's the long-term outlook, which seems sort of scary on one side, very full of opportunity on the other, certainly for this industry. There is tremendous growth potential around the world for pulses, for the pulse industry, and for agriculture in general. Looking forward to 2012, pulse production should rise next year. We're looking at for increase in pea acres in the United States, increases in dry edible beans and peas in Canada, dry edible beans in the United States, peas and lentils both in the United States. Different parts of the world perhaps growing more, Russia growing more, India hoping to grow more. So I think there will be a general increase in production. That could bring with it a tendency for prices to become lower through 2014. And here I'm thinking about average annual prices, not month. It doesn't mean that you won't have moments of tremendous spikes, and you won't have commodities which aren't very bullish. But overall, I think we'll see a bit of a downtrend for a couple of years. Lower prices always have the effect of pushing land out of production, and then we could see that happen in about 2015, 2016, which should probably bring about another period of more bullish market conditions. That's, it's one way of looking at it. The other way is that we have to bear in mind that these values have to be competitive relative to other crops. And that's something I'll try to talk about a little bit later on. The World Pulse Forecast looking forward to about 2016. I see a bit of an increase next year. The potential for a bit of a downward slide into 2016, which I talked about, which would just be the result of lower average prices. If prices stay firmer relative to other crops, then that